They said no one came back to Ash Hollow in winter, not alive, anyway. But Boaz Whitlow walked that fence line like a man who'd buried too much to care. The wind moved like something half asleep across the flat white of the valley, dragging behind it whispers from a time no one in town remembered anymore. The sun had dipped past the edge of the canyon, leaving behind only ash-colored clouds and a pale glow that seemed to stretch time itself. In the slow-falling dark, Boaz Whitlow walked the north fence line, rifle slung against his back, his boots breaking through the frozen crust of snow with a sound as final as a clock chime. It had been like this for months. Snow clung to the land with the stubbornness of a dog guarding a grave. Each day followed the same rhythm, waking before light, feeding the mare, cutting firewood, checking the fences, preparing supper that was never enough to call a meal. Time moved in slow layers, not marked by bells or bells' echoes, but by the quiet erosion of grief. It wore down his spine, his voice, the edges of memory, and inside the house. Clara May waited. She didn't cry, hadn't in a long while. Instead, she sat in the rocking chair, legs barely long enough to fold beneath her, and cradled the raggedy cloth doll stitched with yarn hair and a missing button eye. Her eyes were wide and quiet, like she was always listening for something just beyond reach, maybe a voice that used to hum in the evenings, or footsteps that no longer came up the porch. Boaz's face had the same stillness that grave markers carried in winter, the kind of stillness that came from watching too much vanish. His beard was going gray down the middle, and though he wasn't an old man by the count of years, he moved like one who had aged inwardly, as though his bones had become repositories of memory instead of marrow. When he returned from the cold, the sky had gone the color of wet iron. He shook the snow from his coat, leaned the rifle against the door frame with the same motion he'd done every day for the last 2 years, and looked toward Clara. She smiled, small and earnest. Boaz tried to return it, but the corners of his mouth didn't quite remember how. Instead, he lit the oil lamp with the stub of a match and stirred the fire until the coals brightened. Added a log he'd cut last week when the wind had settled long enough for the axe not to shake in his hands. The silence in the room was heavy, not hostile, but thick like it had grown used to being left alone and didn't want to be disturbed. Boaz moved through it with quiet reverence. Clara watched him but didn't speak. She was a child who had learned patience the hard way. In the corner, by the old writing desk tucked beneath the window, a drawer creaked open. Boaz pulled out a letter. The paper yellowed and soft along its folds. No name on the front. No postage. It had never been meant to leave the house. He read the first line again, mouthing it silently. "Dear Miss, I am a widower with 1 daughter. I seek not a servant nor a saint, just someone kind, someone who don't mind quiet." He folded it once more and slid it back into the drawer. He did not sigh. There was no room for indulgence in sighs. Outside, the cold deepened. The fire hissed softly behind the grate. Hours passed, and then Mosby barked. It wasn't the usual slow whine of age or the occasional grumble when a rabbit darted too close to the barn. This bark was short, sharp, surprised. Boaz was on his feet before he even thought about it. His hand found the rifle by the door, but he didn't lift it. Instead, he grabbed the lantern and shrugged his coat back on. The barn was 100 steps away, past the cottonwoods that leaned like old men against the dark. Snow crackled underfoot, brittle and loud in the still night. The lantern swung in his grip, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts in the hollows. Mosby stood by the barn door, tail low but twitching. His ears, half-deaf though they were, pointed forward. Boaz opened the door slow. Warm hay met him first, the smell of horse sweat and old leather. The mare blinked at him from her stall, disinterested. Nothing looked out of place, until he turned the lantern toward the far corner. There, tucked beneath a wool blanket that had once lined the wagon seat, was a shape that didn't belong. Small, still, the form of a woman or something close enough. She didn't move as the light touched her face, only slowly, like waking from something too deep to name. Did her eyes blink open? Her gaze met his, calm but empty. Not afraid, just tired. The kind of tired that lived in the bones, not the skin. "I'll go," she whispered before he said anything. Her voice rasped with cold or disuse. Boaz stepped closer, lowering the lantern. "You know this is my barn." She nodded. Didn't mean to trespass, just needed out the wind. Her coat was too thin for the weather, buttons missing, edges frayed. A laced-up satchel rested beside her, the kind worn from years, not months. "What's your name?" he asked. "Temperance Vale," she said, but then hesitated. "Though, folks used to call me Florence." Boaz looked at her, then not just at her coat or her shoes or the wear in her voice, but at how still she sat, like someone used to being told, "No." "No call to sleep out here," he said finally. "Come inside. There's stew on the stove." She glanced up, startled for the first time. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're already here," he said, and though it sounded rough, he meant it gently. She gathered her things without complaint. Motsby followed her like he'd known her for years. They walked back through the snow, the wind pulling at their coats, the house ahead a shape hunched against the night. Boaz opened the door and let her in first. He gave her the chair nearest the fire, poured a bowl of stew, and set it in front of her without a word. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone used to stretching meals, not someone starving. When she finished, he showed her to the spare room, the one with the quilt his wife had made the year Clara was born. Temperance set her satchel down by the wall. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, didn't say more. That night. The fire burned steady, but something else sparked. Boaz Whitlow lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the wind scrape across the glass panes. He didn't think of graves, or ghosts, or the ache of all he'd buried. He thought only this. This wasn't just a visitor curled up behind the spare room door. It was the beginning of a shift he hadn't asked for, but couldn't stop. He lit the fire, set stew on the table, and said nothing but his silence had changed its shape. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the hush remained, not peace, just the weight of things unsaid. The sun lifted slowly, as if it too had grown weary from holding back the cold. Light spilled across the frozen land in ribbons of gray and gold, dusting the tops of the fence posts and the roof of the barn like sugar too fine to settle. The air held the smell of meltwater and wood smoke, the promise of something almost soft, but not yet. Boaz stood at the window, his coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the day crawl out from under the weight of winter. Behind him, the fire crackled low, its rhythm steady but subdued. The house was quiet, but not with grief. It was the quiet of waiting, not loss. The shawl still hung on the hook near the door. It hadn't been moved since Miriam died. Florence hadn't touched it, hadn't asked. But Boaz had seen her glance at it once, just once, her eyes lowering as if it carried something sacred. In the spare room, she was already awake. Had been, maybe, for hours. She sat on the edge of the bed with her boots in her lap, lacing them with slow, careful fingers. Her coat was folded neatly beside her bag, and the bed she had slept in looked untouched, the quilt laid back as if she hadn't dared disturb it. Her face was calm, but Boaz could see a certain tightness in the jaw, the quiet resignation of a woman who had been told more than once that it was time to move on. "I'll be on my way," she said softly. But her eyes lingered on the coffee, on the chair, still warm, as if part of her hadn't quite made up its mind. His arms folded across his chest. Not defensive, just something to do with hands that otherwise might reach. "Where would you go?" She hesitated, a shrug barely lifting her shoulders. "There's always somewhere. You came a long way to turn around. I've made do before." She looked at the floor. "I always land on my feet. Might just take longer in this snow." He looked at her then. Not the way he had the night before. Not as a stranger to be tolerated or a problem to be solved, but as someone who had shared silence with him. Someone who had mended something invisible when she stitched the tear in the curtains. Someone who had folded the child's blankets without a word. "There's coffee," he said. Not as a distraction, but as an offering. Florence glanced up. Her gaze lingered, searching his for judgment, for obligation, for anything that might make staying feel like charity. She found none of it, and that was answer enough. She stepped into the kitchen just as Clara emerged from the hallway, hair tousled from sleep, dragging her doll by one arm. The girl blinked at Florence with wide eyes, uncertain. Florence gave a soft, gentle smile. Clara, after a breath, smiled back. Boaz set 3 plates on the table without remark. And no one questioned it. The cornbread was dry, and the eggs were thin. But it was the first breakfast in a long time that didn't echo. Later. Boaz stood at the back gate, nails in hand, a hammer slung through his belt loop. The hinge had cracked from the cold and wouldn't hold long once the thaw finished what winter had started. Florence joined him, her sleeves rolled up, holding a small tin of nails. She didn't speak unless asked, but her presence didn't require words. She moved like someone who had learned the art of usefulness in silence. "You done much farm work?" Boaz asked without looking up. "Bits, here and there. Helped dig a well once. Didn't enjoy it." He grunted. She passed him a nail without needing to be told. In the yard. Clara wandered with her doll. At one point, the thread came loose in the doll's arm, spilling a puff of stuffing into the breeze. Florence noticed before the child did. She crouched down, pulled a needle and thread from her skirt pocket blue, not matching the doll's dress, but sturdy, and began to sew. Her hands were nimble, her eyes steady. Clara watched, entranced. She was a gift, Florence asked gently. Clara nodded. Mama made her. Florence nodded back. She did a fine job. Clara looked up. She sang too. Florence didn't answer right away. She tied off the stitch, brushed a lock of hair from Clara's face. Maybe someday. You'll remember the tune. That afternoon. Florence stood at the edge of the porch, looking toward the trees beyond the barn. The wind had picked up again, not sharp like the day before, but restless. Her posture was still, but her gaze reached far. Boaz joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "How'd you come by that letter?" he asked. She didn't look at him at first. Her gloved fingers ran along the porch railing, tracing the worn grain of the wood. In a paper bundle. Woman at the church agency in St. Louis handed it to me. Said it never got answered. Thought maybe the reply got lost. But it sounded like the kind of place I'd suit. Boaz was quiet a long time. "I didn't mean for it to go anywhere," he said. Wrote it in a moment I couldn't sleep. Just a whisper. Really? Florence smiled, faint and tired. Sometimes whispers carry farther than shouts. You thought to come all this way without hearing back. Didn't have much left where I was. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Boaz didn't press, but his silence asked. And she chose to answer. I worked at a dry goods store. The owner's wife took ill. He asked for help. Then he asked for more. I said no. Lost the job. Lost the room. Her voice didn't shake, but it narrowed, like light through a slit in a boarded-up window. This place isn't much either, he said finally. It's honest. She looked sideways at him. That's more than most. That evening. Florence peeled potatoes near the stove, humming under her breath. Clara leaned into her, chattering in the disjointed way of children whose minds ran faster than their words. Boaz sat at the table, elbows on the wood, watching the two of them. Something shifted in him. Not a fire, not a spark, just a slow kindling. A flicker in a house long cold. When the dishes were dried and the fire banked low, Florence lingered near the hearth. Boaz poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. You were married before, he asked. She shook her head once. Almost. He waited. Said all the right things. Told me I was enough until the day I wasn't. Said I'd aged too fast. Said I was too plain. Left before the banns were even posted. Boaz's jaw moved, but he said only, he was a fool. Maybe. She held the cup with both hands. Or maybe he just wanted something I never was. Boaz looked into the fire. Truth is, I never expected to feel much of anything again. She didn't answer, but her fingers curled tighter around the cup. That was enough. Later that night, Boaz passed by the spare room and saw Florence brushing Clara's hair. The lullaby is wordless, but familiar. Some men knock like they own the door, some like they regret ever finding it. Elias knocked like he'd done both. It came late in the day, when the shadows of the cottonwoods had stretched long enough to touch the corners of the porch, and the light had gone sharp and slanted. The wind had settled into a quiet hum along the eaves, just enough to rattle the loose pane in the parlor window. Florence was stringing beans on the porch steps, Clara beside her, sorting the smaller pods into a cracked enamel bowl. Inside, the fire whispered low, steady as a breath. Boaz had been mending the hinges on the cellar door. Then came the knock. Not the kind that asked permission, not the kind that waited. Florence's hands paused mid-thread, and her eyes turned toward the door before Boaz had even set down his tools. Clara looked up, sensing something in the stillness. He opened it without hurry, but with a readiness sharpened by years. The man on the other side stood tall in a clean wool coat, boots dusted but polished, hat in hand. His smile was small, fixed at the edges. His eyes flicked past Boaz toward the porch, then back again. The way a man measures how much of the past still lingers in the present. Elias, Florence said, her voice flat as a dry road. He smiled with a kind of old charm that cracked under the weight of its own memory. Didn't expect to find you all the way out here, he said. I didn't leave a map. Florence rose from the steps, but didn't move closer. Clara stood too, uncertain, her hand reaching instinctively for the hem of Florence's skirt. Boaz didn't speak yet. He stood in the doorway, not blocking it, but not moving aside either. I came to talk, Elias said, glancing down at his boots. Maybe settle what was left wrong. Florence shook her head once. There's no interest in that. His eyes fell to Clara. You've got a daughter now. She's mine. Florence answered before the words had fully landed. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She's been mine since the day she wrapped her arms around my neck, and didn't ask what I'd done wrong to be alone. Clara's hand clung tighter. Elias studied her with a kind of long, appraising gaze that made Boaz shift his stance. "I made mistakes," Elias said, "but time changes a man." Florence gave a bitter half-smile. "It never changed your timing. You always come when I'm just about all right again." He had the decency not to answer that. Instead, he looked again toward the house, the fence line, the smoke curling up from the chimney like a thread tethering something real. "You married him." "Yes," she said. A lie yet to be true, but spoken as fact. Elias's jaw worked a moment. "You deserve better." "I have better." Boaz finally stepped down off the porch, his boots finding the earth with the solid weight of a man who didn't bluff. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bristle or square his shoulders like a showman. He simply stood there, steady. "You've said what you came to say," Boaz told him. Elias's gaze narrowed. "She deserves fire, not a man who builds walls around grief." Boaz didn't flinch. "She doesn't need fire. She needs steadiness. Peace." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of horses and the distant sound of something metal, clanking, maybe a bit tapping against teeth, or a latch left loose on the barn. Florence stepped forward now, placing Clara gently behind her. "You didn't come here to win me back," she said. "You came to see if I was still breakable." Her voice was not loud, but it hit like a bell rung in the heart of a church. "I'm not." Elias looked at her a long while. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off, but not before casting one last glance toward Clara. Like a man not yet finished. He didn't offer a farewell, just turned and rode back the way he came, leaving a long trail of silence behind him. Boaz watched until he was gone. Florence stood quiet, not shaken, but not untouched. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. Slow. "Yes, more than I expected to be." Inside, Clara pulled at her hand. "Was he your friend?" the girl asked. "No," Florence said. "Not ever. Really." That night. After supper had been cleared and the lantern trimmed low, Boaz sat by the hearth, while Florence folded Clara's clothes beside him. The girl had already gone to bed, tucked beneath quilts that carried a faded scent of cedar and thyme. Neither Florence nor Boaz spoke, not until the quiet grew so deep it felt like it might start to echo. "I don't know what to do with you being here," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "You want me gone?" "No, that's the trouble." She didn't answer. She tied off a ribbon with careful hands, then looked at him. "I never came to replace her," she said gently. "I came because I had nowhere left to go. I stayed because kindness like yours is rare." Boaz looked down, the fire's light flickering in his eyes. "I don't feel kind." "You are," she said. "You just forgot how to show it to yourself." And that was all. They didn't touch. They didn't reach for more than what had already been offered in the silence. But the warmth between them held. That night. Clara calls her Mama in her sleep. Florence doesn't correct her. She doesn't speak at all. But inside, something shifts. Not pain, not fear, just the deep, unexpected ache of being needed again. She reaches for Clara's hand and holds it until the girl settles once more. There are mornings that slip in unnoticed, and there are ones that crack the sky open. Boaz rode out before either kind had begun. The frost hadn't let go yet, though the calendar might have hinted spring. Ash Hollow still wore winter like a second skin. Beneath the moonlight, the land was silver and hushed. The trees stood like ghosts, and the soil, hard as bone, gave no scent of thaw. But Boaz was already in the barn, saddling the mare by lantern light. The air inside steamed from the heat of the animal and his own breath. He moved with purpose, not haste, as if each buckle and cinch held weight beyond the task itself. The fire had burned down, low in the house. He'd risen before it stirred, before Clara rolled over in her quilt, before Florence stepped into her boots, before anyone could say goodbye. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. He'd told her everything the night before, at least. Everything he knew how to say. Now he rode. The trail to town wound east across a long stretch of lowland that remained glazed in ice until well past sunup. The mare moved slow and careful, hooves crunching against the crusted top. The stars hung overhead, fixed and watching, ancient witnesses to another man trying to find the right words before sunrise. In the chapel at the far edge of town, Reverend Eli Kern answered the door in his long wool robe, blinking against the cold and rubbing his jaw like he hadn't been awake since Christmas. Boaz took his hat off, breath hanging in the lamplight between them. "I need a ceremony." The Reverend looked him up and down. "Before the sun's up." "She don't know yet," Boaz said, "but she will." The Reverend didn't question further. He simply nodded and stepped back to dress, back at the homestead. The house was still and expectant. Ash Hollow held its breath in those final dark hours before dawn, when the world hadn't quite decided whether it would start over or not. Florence stood in the kitchen, coat buttoned, bag at her feet. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were clear, but tired. Her posture carried the weight of something unspoken, like she was braced for goodbye. Boaz stepped inside and set a small box on the table. "I went to town," he said simply. Florence didn't move. I figured as much. He nodded once, then pushed the box toward her across the table's worn wood. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she studied him, eyes searching for anything that might smell like pity or obligation. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I'm not good with feelings, but I know this: you showed up when I didn't think anything good ever would again." He paused, jaw tight, hands clasped before him like they held something fragile. "You mended more than clothes. You mended this place. You mended me." She finally opened the box. Inside, a silver ring rested in a velvet pocket, plain but polished, without flourish, the kind of ring you didn't wear to impress, but to promise. Tears trembled at the edges of her lashes. She didn't let them fall. "I don't want to ask you to stay because I'm lonely," Boaz continued. "I want to ask because I finally see what's been standing in front of me, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have had if I'd kept my mouth shut." Florence didn't speak. Not right away. She set her bag back down on the floor, gently this time, not like it might need to be picked up again. "I'm not perfect," she said. "Neither am I. I scare easy. I'll wait. I need more than shelter, Boaz." He met her gaze. "I'll give what I can. Every day." That was it. No grand vow, no piano or lace. Just two people staring at something neither had dared to imagine was still possible. She stepped closer and placed her hand in his. The sun hadn't crested yet. They saddled the mare again, this time with Clara between them. Her small hands tucked inside Florence's shawl. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The child had started to understand the weight of silence, and how sometimes it could be a kind of prayer. The town hadn't woken. Its windows were dark, its chimneys still unlit. The chapel sat small and sloped on the edge of the bluff, cross crooked on the steeple, its whitewashed paint flaking like dried skin. Reverend Kern stood at the steps, lantern in hand, smile sleepy but warm. Inside, The pews creaked as they sat. The floorboards sighed under each footstep like they remembered the burden of old weddings and funerals alike. The air smelled faintly of cedar and melted wax. Florence stood beside Boaz in her simple blue dress and the shawl wrapped close across her shoulders. No bouquet, no veil, just clarity. Reverend Kern spoke plainly. "Do you come here by your own will?" Florence answered, "Yes." "Do you promise to walk beside each other? Not ahead, not behind." "Yes." "Do you vow to give not what is perfect, but what is real?" Boaz looked at her then, and something inside him steadied. "I choose you," he said, "because you saw me when I forgot I was worth seeing." Her eyes filled, and she nodded through the tears. There was no kiss, no crowd, just 3 people walking out into the dawn, and the light rising with them. As they rode home, Clara fell asleep in Florence's lap, her hand curled into the folds of the shawl like it had always been there. The wheels of the wagon cut quiet lines in the snow, and behind them, no one saw the pair of tracks that branched away as if someone had come, watched, and turned back into the trees. The house welcomed them with the warmth of a fire that hadn't yet gone out. Boaz hung up his coat. Florence set Clara gently on the settee, the child still asleep, one boot dangling from her foot. Breakfast was small, a pan of biscuits, a pot of tea. Florence sat by the hearth, unwrapping her hair from its braid. Boaz brought her a cup. Their hands brushed no spark, no fire, just warmth. As they ride toward the chapel at dawn, Clara asleep between them, Florence's hand finds Boaz's without a word. Ash Hollow didn't look different the day they married, but it felt it. Even the snow melted a little faster. The morning after the wedding brought no celebration, no ribboned doorway, no guests gathered to toast. Yet something in the wind had changed. It carried the smell of damp soil, of fences beginning to thaw, of last year's grass re-emerging under tired snow. Even the barn groaned less, like the boards themselves had stopped bracing for collapse. Florence stood in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled. Flour dusted up her arms as she worked a small mound of dough into something warm for breakfast. Clara sat at the table, swinging her legs, humming to her doll as she traced shapes into the condensation on the window pane. Boaz watched them both from the doorway, arms folded across his chest, a small smile tucked into the corner of his beard. He didn't speak, didn't want to break whatever quiet magic had settled. Outside, the yard carried the first mud of the season. Little rivers ran along the ruts carved by wagon wheels, and from the barn's eaves, icicles dropped one by one, like forgotten prayers. They were a family now, not by blood, not even by ceremony anyone would talk about. But the house knew. It carried the hush of a place no longer grieving. Later that day, Florence knelt in the yard, a patch of beans in her apron, her hands moving with slow, steady grace as she picked through the softened soil near the porch. Clara darted nearby, arms spread like wings, shouting names for birds that didn't yet exist. Boaz had gone to the north line to check the fence post that always leaned first in the thaw. When the sound of hooves returned to the hollow, it didn't come as surprise. Florence was the first to hear it. Not because it was loud, it wasn't. Just the deliberate, even rhythm of a man who rode like he wanted to be seen. She stood slowly, brushing soil from her palms. Clara stopped too, drawn by the sudden stillness in Florence's frame. Boaz appeared around the house just as the rider came into view. Elias Drenner. Again, but this time, no smile curled beneath his mustache. His eyes were hard beneath the brim of a black hat. The coat he wore clean, but creased like it had been packed and unpacked in anger. He dismounted slowly, gaze sweeping the property as if taking inventory. Florence stepped forward, Clara behind her. Boaz came up alongside them. Elias nodded once. "You didn't leave," he said. Not quite a question. Florence didn't answer. He took a step closer. "That child, she's not yours by blood." "She's mine," Florence said, her voice even, unwavering. "By marriage now. Maybe." Elias looked at Boaz. "But that ain't what's written anywhere." Boaz's brow furrowed. Elias took another step forward, his tone sharpening. "You took her, left town without saying a word, then came here like none of it mattered. That's not law. That's theft." Florence's hands didn't move, but Boaz saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. Elias looked at him directly now. "And you? You're a man who claims truth but marries a lie. You sure this woman didn't just run from consequence?" Boaz didn't react the way Elias might have expected. No fists, no fury. Instead, he turned, walked into the house, and returned with a slip of folded paper. He held it out. "The letter I wrote," Boaz said. "The one she found. I never sent it, but somehow it got to her." Elias took it, eyes narrowing. He read in silence. "Someone kind," he repeated. "This was never meant for anyone." "But it found her anyway," Boaz said. Florence finally spoke, her voice soft but sharp. "I didn't take a child. I gave her what no one else offered belonging." Elias looked again at Clara, then at Florence. "You always had a way with pretty words," he muttered. "But words don't erase the truth." Boaz stepped forward. "She didn't steal nothing. Not love. Not a name. She earned it more than most men earn anything." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he folded the letter and handed it back. Then he walked away, not with the pride of someone who'd won, but with the stiff spine of a man who realized the ground beneath him no longer belonged to him. The sound of his horse carried faintly across the thawing land until it faded. Boaz let out a slow breath. Clara turned to Florence and wrapped her arms around her waist. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Florence pressed her palm to the window pane, as if trying to touch the future outside, one she was no longer afraid to live. The dark settled over Ash Hollow, but for the first time, she didn't brace against it. She welcomed it like a visitor she'd made peace with. Boaz joined her, silent. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Boaz shook his head. "Not for anything he could take." Florence turned to him, her eyes tired but not afraid. "I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder." "You won't have to." Behind them, the fire popped, and somewhere upstairs, Clara turned in her sleep. Florence exhaled slowly, the window fogging beneath her breath. That night. Florence wakes to Clara pressed tight against her and whispers, "You are mine, too." The storm came fast and wild. Like winter's last protest, lightning forked like veins across the dark. The wind began its warning hours before the sky split open. It stirred the brittle grass, rattled the shutters Boaz hadn't yet fixed, and pulled low clouds over Ash Hollow like a curtain drawn tight. By supper time, the clouds were so heavy the land looked bruised, and the air smelled of rain and something older, like wet stone and iron. Inside, the house was warm, wrapped in lamplight and the smell of beans cooking low on the stove. Clara chattered as she fed crumbs to the barn cat nestled in her lap, and Florence listened with a half-smile while mending one of the girl's socks, a worn patch thinning around the heel. Boaz sat nearby, quiet, one boot off, the other halfway unlaced, his eyes on the window where the trees were beginning to sway. He had always been a man who watched weather the way others read newspapers. There was something in the roll of the clouds, the shift in the weight of air, that told him this storm would not be kind. By nightfall, thunder cracked over the valley like a shot. Clara startled, the cat bolted, and Florence rose without a word, heading to check the latches on the back windows. Boaz lit the oil lamp in the hallway and found her by the window in Clara's room, securing the sash with a piece of twine. "You get storms like this often?" she asked, not looking up. "Not this early in the season," he said. "Not with this bite." Outside, wind howled, ripping across the fields and shaking the barn doors. The mare stomped once in her stall, and Boaz made a mental note to check her if the gale let up, when Clara cried out from her bed. Florence was already at her side, soothing with soft words Boaz couldn't quite hear. She sat with the child, brushing hair back from her face, singing low. It was the same tune she'd hummed that first night. No words, just sound shaped like a lullaby remembered from too far back. Boaz lingered in the doorway, arms folded, leaning against the frame. The sight of the two of them the child soothed. The woman steady settled something in his chest that had long been restless. When the storm reached its peak, lightning lit the house in blue. Thunder followed in a breath, shaking the panes. But inside, it was calm. Florence did not flinch. Clara fell asleep with her head on Florence's lap. Afterward, they sat in the parlor, the fire low and steady again. Boaz handed Florence a cup of tea and took the seat beside her. "You know," she murmured, staring into the flames, "I think I was waiting my whole life to stop waiting." Boaz's hand moved slightly, resting near hers on the armrest. "You were always meant to be found," he said. She looked at him then, full and quiet. The next morning, the land glistened under a fresh wash of rain. Puddles clung to the edges of the porch, and the sky above had finally let go of its anger. A soft blue peeked through torn cloud edges, and birds returned, as if they'd just remembered how to sing. Florence stepped outside, barefoot, the mud cool between her toes, the breeze fresh. She tilted her face upward, eyes closed. Behind her, Clara ran circles in the yard, chasing one of the first butterflies of the season, her laughter light and unburdened. Boaz leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, the sun at his back. He watched them like a man who had finally let himself believe in the future. Not the grand kind, no riches, no miracles, but the kind that meant warmth, and rhythm, and shared silence. Florence turned toward him, her dress hem muddy, her smile not wide but true. He opened his arms, and she walked to him without hesitation. And for once, the world didn't need to say anything at all. The silence was already full, and so it ends, not with a bang or a fire, but with the slow hush of spring rain on an old roof, the echo of boots on wooden porch planks, and the low murmur of voices that have long since learned not to rush. Ash Hollow may still sit quiet on the map, a forgotten dot along the edge of the old Arizona territory. But something changed there. Something stitched itself back into the world where the wind had once torn it loose. The fire didn't just keep the cold out anymore. It kept the memory warm, the promise lit, the silence filled. There are stories like this all over the West, tucked into hillsides and carved into barn doors. But most don't get told. Most stay buried like unmarked graves beneath the cottonwoods. But this one rose, like a seed cracked open by frost. You might remember the sound of Clara's giggle trailing behind her as she chased butterflies in a muddy yard, or Florence's bare feet pressing into thawed soil. like she was finally grounded in a life that wouldn't shift beneath her. You might still feel the weight of Boaz's silence, not heavy anymore, but full of meaning, like a well dug deep enough to hold memory and sorrow in equal measure. There was that letter, to the one that was never mailed, but still found its way. A paper prayer folded in the dark and answered in its own strange time. And the shawl, thick with lavender and cedar, passed from ghost to hand to home, wrapping not just shoulders, but hearts that had been too long bare. It wasn't love at first glance, not even second, but something better earned love, the kind that walks beside you instead of riding in like cavalry. And maybe you felt something when Elias rode off for the last time, the dust behind him already vanishing, because the past only owns you if you keep feeding it. He wasn't the villain, not really just another man too used to having things and too slow to notice when he lost them. The real story lived in the quiet things: the mended sock, the extra plate set without remark, the quilt folded with both grief and grace in every seam. You could hear it in the way Florence never raised her voice, not even when life had every reason to, and how Boaz learned that silence could be a gift, not a wound. Honor, it turns out, can be buried but not erased. It waits, like wildflowers under snow, for the sun to return. Justice may take the long way around, arriving with mud on its boots and no crowd to welcome it. But it still matters. And sometimes the one who is forgotten turns out to be the one who saves a whole generation of tenderness. Florence was never a name folks would write songs about, but she'll live on in the way Clara says mama now, and in the way Boaz sets his gloves near the stove without thinking twice. There's peace in that. The kind you don't need to shout to be sure of. The kind of peace that doesn't erase sorrow but gives it a room of its own. And forgiveness, too, not given out of pity, but shared like bread when the storm's past and all you've got left is each other. If you believe there's still room in this world for that kind of quiet courage for women like Florence, for men like Boaz, for children who grow wild but strong, then maybe leave a mark. Maybe type 1 to say, you heard this story with your heart, not just your ears. Maybe follow the trail to Westwind Whispers, where stories like this still breathe and wait by the fire for someone to listen. Not every story ends with a sunset and a 6-shooter. Some just settle like dust on your boots. Soft, real, and never quite forgotten. So if you're still out there, listening by oil lamplight, if you still believe that a home can be rebuilt from broken things, that a name spoken softly is stronger than a shout, that silence can be sacred, and that even the wrong town might someday make something right, then carry this story with you. Carry it like a letter in your coat pocket, the kind that might never be mailed but still finds its way. Carry it like the wind carries the scent of wild sage across the wide open. And know that some stories don't end, they just find another porch to sit on, waiting for you to come back.